Hilarie Hicks, and I'm the Senior Research Historian here at James Madison's Montpelier. In the new library, I talked about how Madison, towards the end of his life, pretty much spent his time in two rooms, the new library and this room. But even before he reached that point, throughout most of the 1830s, he was spending a lot of time in this room, and this is where visitors usually met with him in the 1830s, either sitting up in a chair or lying in his bed. And he sometimes quipped to visitors that he could converse better when lying. This room has a door that opens onto the dining room, and that door was usually left open so that James could participate in the dinner table conversation even if he didn't feel up to sitting at the table. And this whole scenario is quite a bit different than what visitors described in the 18-teens and 20s, when James was still exercising on the portico and riding around the plantation with his guests and telling his capital stories at the dinner table. Dr. Robley Dunlison, who was a University of Virginia professor, and he was James's friend as well as his doctor, talked about how James Madison was a convivial and entertaining host, even from a distance. And this is what he wrote. When confined to the bed or the sofa in the next room, he would invite me to take his place at table and call out that if I did not pass the wine more freely, he would cashier me. Now, cashier was a military term on the order of a dishonorable discharge, so clearly James took that job very seriously, of passing the bottles around the table. Another visitor who came to Montpelier in the 1830s was John Latrobe, who was the son of James and Dolly's old friends, Benjamin and Mary Hazelhurst Latrobe, who had helped Dolly to furnish the White House. And this is what John Latrobe said he saw when he was ushered into this room. Mr. Madison was lying on a French bed supported by pillows, a white cap drawn down to his eyebrows, and a white flannel dressing gown wrapped around his attenuated form. Mrs. Madison mentioned my name, and extending his hand to me, he gave warm and welcome greeting in a voice whose clearness, strength, and steadiness astonished me. I seated myself on a chair at his bedside. Dinner time arrived long before I expected it. Dinner was served in a room adjoining Mr. Madison's in very handsome style. Mrs. Madison, J. Payne Todd, her son, a niece of hers, a child quite, and myself, sitting down to it. Rarely had I drunk finer wine. After dinner, Mr. Madison, who sees the table from where he lies, called to me, and the conversation, which dinner interrupted, was resumed and continued until 9:30. Another visitor to Montpelier in this period was Harriet Martineau, and she was a British writer and abolitionist. And when she was here, she talked with Madison about the American Colonization Society, which was an organization set up to resettle freed slaves in Africa. James Madison was the president of the American Colonization Society, and he thought it could play a role in ultimately ending slavery. Madison had written that it seems to be indelible that the two races cannot coexist, both being free and equal. So in Madison's opinion, any plan to abolish slavery also had to include a plan for relocating the newly freed enslaved people, either in Africa or in western part of the United States or some other location. And Harriet Martineau didn't really think much of that idea, as you'll hear from what she said about her visit. Madison was in his chair with a pillow behind him when I first saw him, his little person wrapped in a black silk gown, a warm gray and white cap upon his head, which his lady took care should always sit becomingly, and gray worsted gloves, his hands having been rheumatic. His voice was clear and strong, and his manner of speaking particularly lively, often playful. His relish for conversation could never have been keener. I was in perpetual fear of his being exhausted, and at the end of every few hours I left my seat by the arm of his chair and went to the sofa by Mrs. Madison on the other side of the room. But he was sure to follow and sit down between us. so that when I found the only effect of my moving was to deprive him of the comfort of his own chair, I returned to my station. His faith in the American government shone brightly through the whole of Mr. Madison's conversation, except on one subject. With regard to slavery, he owned himself almost to be in despair. He had been quite so till the institution of the Colonization Society. How such a mind as his could derive any alleviation to its anxiety from that source is surprising. I think it must have been from his overflowing faith, for the facts were before him that in 18 years the Colonization Society had removed only between 2,000 and 3,000 persons, while the annual increase of the slave population in the United States was upward of 60,000. And Martineau had some interesting comments about Dolly Madison also on this visit. Mrs. M is celebrated throughout the country for the grace and dignity with which she discharged the arduous duties which devolve upon the President's lady. For a term of 8 years, she administered the hospitalities of the White House with such discretion, impartiality, and kindliness that it is believed she gratified everyone and offended nobody. She is a strong-minded woman, fully capable of entering into her husband's occupations and cares, and there is little doubt that he owed much to her intellectual companionship, as well as to her ability in sustaining the outward dignity of his office. Now, everybody talks about Dolly as a delightful hostess, but this is the one time where we hear someone praising her as a strong-minded woman and an intellectual companion for James. And that means a lot coming from Harriet Martineau, who was a pretty strong-minded woman herself.